the fortress nobody could afford. Tobruk was supposed to be a footnote, a dusty Libyan harbor the British might lose and retake like so many desert outposts. Instead, it became an obsession that swallowed 1941, a siege that lasted 241 days, trapped tens of thousands of men, and bent entire campaigns around one cramped port. The riddle is simple but brutal. How did Tobruk become so important that generals risked armies to save it, and why did the fight turn into a long, grinding stalemate instead of a quick victory? Because in North Africa, logistics weren't background details, they were destiny. And at Tobruk, destiny came down to fuel, water, and a strip of coastline that could feed an army, or starve it. Tobruk's name became a symbol. For the British, it was proof the empire could still hold under pressure. For the Axis, it was a thorn driven into their supply line, a British garrison sitting inside what was supposed to be Rommel's forward base. But then something even stranger happened. Both sides began making plans that assumed Tobruk mattered more than their actual manpower. That's how you get a siege that outlives commanders, wrecks timetables, and forces decisions that still look irrational, until you see the map the way they did. North Africa's real battlefield, distance. In 1941, the Desert War wasn't decided by who had the best tank. It was decided by who could keep tanks moving. Every mile east from Tripoli stretched the Axis supply line, every mile west from Alexandria stretched the British. Ports were life support machines. A good harbor could shorten a supply route by hundreds of miles of truck convoys. A bad one meant jerrycans and breakdowns scattered like bones along the coastal road. That's why Tobruk mattered. It was a deep water port with storage capacity and a road link along the coast. If the Axis controlled it, Rommel could supply an advance toward Egypt far more efficiently. If the British held it, they forced the Axis to haul supplies from Tripoli, over 900 miles away, through sand, heat, and Allied air and naval attacks. In desert arithmetic, that distance could have the usable fuel delivered to the front. Politically, too, Tobruk had weight. Churchill needed victories, or at least the appearance of stubborn resistance, after earlier setbacks in Greece and Crete. The Mediterranean was a prestige theater as much as a strategic one. A fortress that refused to fall could become propaganda. That propaganda would then become policy. And policy would become orders. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. Two generals, two urgencies. On the Axis side stood Erwin Rommel, newly famous, aggressively mobile, and operating with a constant shortage of supplies. Rommel's instinct was to keep punching forward, to solve problems by movement, and to gamble that the enemy would crack before his own logistics did. Tobruk, held behind his lines, was unacceptable, not because it threatened his rear in a classic sense, but because it denied him the very port he needed to sustain any deeper drive. On the Allied side, command was messy. The British Middle East command structure shifted repeatedly in 1941. General Archibald Wavell had initially overseen successes against the Italians, then faced reversals. He would later be replaced by Claude Auchinleck. On the ground, commanders changed, plans changed, and expectations changed, sometimes faster than units could redeploy. Meanwhile, inside Tobruk, the garrison, initially heavily Australian, with British and other Commonwealth units, was told to hold at all costs. And then there were the competing ideas. One camp believed Tobruk should be held as a forward anvil to smash Rommel against when British forces regrouped. Another worried it was a trap, a symbol that would drain men and attention. Rommel wanted it quickly, the British wanted it heroically. Those desires collided with reality. The siege takes shape. After early 1941 fighting, Rommel's Afrika Korps surged east, pushing British forces back. Tobruk, however, remained in Allied hands. The defenders dug in. The perimeter defenses, minefields, anti-tank ditches, strongpoints, were not invincible, but they were organized enough to punish frontal assaults. The desert around Tobruk wasn't a wall, it was an open killing ground if approached without preparation. Rommel tried to take the port quickly. The problem was that speed, which served him in open maneuver, worked against him in siege warfare. A fortress required artillery, careful coordination, and sustained supply. But Rommel's units were always short on fuel and ammunition, and his reinforcements and heavy siege equipment were limited. Some accounts suggest he underestimated the defenders' cohesion early on. Others argue he simply had no better option. Leaving Tobruk alone would cripple his operational reach. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy and Allied shipping ran supplies into Tobruk under constant threat, what became known as the Tobruk Ferry Service. It was dangerous, but it kept the garrison alive. As long as the port functioned even partially, Tobruk remained a British thorn and a supply lifeline. The siege solidified into a grim routine: bombardment, raids, counter-raids, attrition. The decision point: make Tobruk the center of gravity. Here's where "how did it come to that" becomes concrete. The British High Command began to treat Tobruk not merely as a position, but as the position, so central that major relief offensives were designed around it. The first major attempt, Operation Brevity, May 1941, aimed to regain key ground and ease pressure. It achieved limited success but did not break the siege. The second, Operation Battleaxe, June 1941, was more ambitious, intended to relieve Tobruk outright. It failed, and the cost was not just tanks and men, it was confidence and command stability. Battleaxe's failure contributed to Wavell's replacement. Why keep gambling? Because Tobruk shaped every supply calculation. If Tobruk fell, the Axis could shorten their supply line, strengthen their front, and potentially make an advance into Egypt far more plausible. If Tobruk held, Rommel's spearhead remained a spearhead, sharp but starving. So the decision was made: explicitly and implicitly, Tobruk would be held, and the field army would risk itself repeatedly to relieve it. Headquarters called it essential. Critics would later call it fixation. Immediate consequences: stalemate becomes strategy. Once Tobruk was treated as the center, the Desert War began to orbit it. Rommel had to allocate forces to contain the fortress, forces that could have strengthened his frontier. The British had to allocate forces to relieve it, forces that might have been used to rebuild strength and choose a different battlefield. Inside Tobruk, the defenders did not simply endure. They conducted aggressive night raids to disrupt Axis lines, destroy equipment, and maintain morale. The Rats of Tobruk label, first intended as an insult, later adopted as a badge, became part of the psychological battle. But attrition mounted. Men lived under shelling, limited water, disease, flies, and constant tension. For the Axis, the siege meant grinding resource drain without the payoff of capturing the port. For the Allies, it meant constant pressure to perform a relief they weren't fully prepared to execute, again and again. The siege also created a narrative trap. Once Tobruk was symbolic, abandoning it became politically difficult even if it might have been militarily rational at a given moment. The cost: time, men, and a war of exhaustion. The true cost of Tobruk wasn't just the casualties, though they were real and sustained. It was the way the siege consumed time. In 1941, time mattered because both sides were rebuilding, shipping reinforcements, and fighting parallel wars elsewhere. Every month Rommel spent containing Tobruk was a month he wasn't driving east, but also a month the British spent tied down, trying to save a position rather than choosing a strategic reset. For the British, failed relief operations cost tanks, precious in a theater where replacements took weeks or months to arrive. For the Axis, every day of siege meant more supply convoys exposed to interdiction, more fuel burned hauling fuel, and more aircraft sorties diverted. Desert warfare is famously circular that way: the more you move supplies, the more supplies you consume. Politically, Tobruk's endurance mattered to London. It offset humiliations and helped Churchill argue that the Mediterranean theater was not collapsing. But it also created pressure, an expectation that the army would do something, even when the balance of forces wasn't favorable. Real alternatives: what else could they have done? Historians disagree on whether holding Tobruk was unquestionably correct. One interpretation is that Tobruk was a strategic necessity. Losing it would have made Rommel's logistics dramatically easier and increased the danger to Egypt and the Suez Canal. From this view, Every sacrifice to hold it was justified because it kept the Axis at the end of a long, fragile supply chain. Another interpretation is harsher, that Tobruk became a prestige trap. The British could have withdrawn the garrison earlier, trading symbolic resistance for manpower and flexibility. They might have shortened their lines, built stronger positions closer to Egypt, and forced Rommel to overextend without the distraction of a fortress behind him. In this view, the relief operations were too rushed and too shaped by politics. But there's a counter to the counter-argument: withdrawing under pressure is not free. Evacuation risks catastrophe at sea, demoralization, and giving the enemy a working port. In desert logistics terms, handing Rommel Tobruk could have been like giving him a new engine mid-race. Myths, controversies, and the fog of command. Tobruk's story is often told as a clean morality play, heroic defenders versus a brilliant attacker. Reality is messier. Rommel's genius sometimes gets overemphasized at the expense of structural factors, supply shortages, Italian contributions, Allied intelligence, and the hard limits of desert movement. Likewise, Allied failures are sometimes blamed on cowardice or incompetence when the real causes include poor communications, doctrinal confusion, and unreliable tank performance. There are disputes about what commanders truly knew at key moments, how accurate their intelligence was, how badly they underestimated minefields, and how much pressure Churchill exerted for action. Memoirs written after the war can sharpen narratives and soften errors. A document that is still being debated, in various forms, is the extent to which political imperatives in London drove operational timelines in Cairo, especially after Battleaxe. Many historians see a strong link, others caution that local commanders also believed action was necessary before Rommel strengthened further. Even the meaning of Tobruk shifts depending on the year. In 1941 it was a defiant holdout. In 1942, when Tobruk eventually fell, it became a shock, proof that symbols can collapse suddenly when the strategic balance changes. Conclusion: the siege that rewired the Desert War. So how did it come to that at Tobruk? Because a single port turned into a lever big enough to move armies. Tobruk wasn't just a place on the map. It was a logistical solution, a political symbol, and a psychological weapon, so powerful that both sides accepted prolonged suffering to possess it or deny it. The siege shows the hidden truth of World War II campaigns: battles are not always won by tactics or bravery alone. Sometimes they are won, or prolonged, by the mathematics of supply and the politics of morale. Tobruk became a fortress not only of concrete and trenches, but of expectations. And once expectations harden, generals can find themselves trapped too, by their own promises, their own headlines, and the unforgiving distances of the desert. If Tobruk teaches one lesson, it's this: in North Africa, the shortest route to victory wasn't always through enemy lines. It was through a port, and through the decisions leaders made when that port became larger than the war around it.